Um, Today we are doing an oral history with Roger Horchow. The interviewer is May Sebel, and this is taking place on November the 10th, 2011. Roger, thanks a lot for agreeing
You're
to meet
welcome.
with you. It's a privilege. First of all, I'd like to ask you about your family, your parents, your grandparents, where you grew up, that kind of thing. So start at the beginning.
Well, I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio in July 3rd, 1928, and my mother was from a little town in Ohio called Crooksville, and my father was from Portsmouth, Ohio, and his parents came to this country in 1880 from Austria-Hungary, and my mother's family, her grandmother came, and her father came from Czechoslovakia, but her grandmother had been another generation earlier. So they all lived in this small town. And my father's side, both his father and his wife, I mean my grandparents on my dad's side, emigrated from also from Austria-Hungary, and they taught school in Vienna, and they came to Portsmouth, Ohio in 1881. So they're all been there a long time. And my father had two brothers, and he was the first, my father was the first Jew in Ohio, I think, to go to Yale. He went in 1912. And then my mother went to the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music, and they got married in 1926. And we lived in Cincinnati until I was about 7, and then we moved to, well, we lived 1 year with my grandparents, and then we moved to Columbus, Ohio. And then when World War II, my father had been in World War I, and when he got out of Yale, and after that he worked for the Hoover's food commission to Armenia, to starving Armenians that we hear about. And then after that he went back to Ohio and he practiced law. And after that, when World War II came, he went back in the Army. He hadn't been in the reserve, but he was very patriotic. And I remember we lived in Columbus on Pearl Harbor Day, and he said he was going to go back in. So he went back in the Army, and we moved to Washington, D.C., where he was. And then he went overseas to Italy for 3 years, and my mother lived in Arlington, Virginia. In the meantime, they sent me off to boarding school because my dad thought he might be moved around. So I went to boarding school in Pennsylvania, the Hill School, and from there I went to Yale, graduated from Hill in 45, Yale in 1950, and then I went in the Army for 3 years, and I was in Army intelligence, and then when I got out of that, I got in my car and drove to Houston, which the reason I went is because I had a job offer. And I worked at Foley's department store. And I started out in the basement in the curtain department. And my boss was a woman who was about 4'10" and a year younger than I, but a terrific boss. And so one day she told me that we were going to have the remnant day the next day, and all the curtains had to be hung up and ironed. So I ironed them, and the sales ladies couldn't believe that I knew how to iron. I said in the Army I had to iron my own uniforms. So that was, I moved from the Foley's basement to the China department. I became the buyer. And then I stayed there 8 years, and Stanley Marcus had offered me a job halfway along there, but I didn't take it. But 8 years later, I had met Carolyn. My wife Carolyn was from Little Rock, and a friend of ours had told us, the salesman who sold China to me, Bob Block from New York, that had a company called Rosenthal Block, and they imported China. Bob Block told me that he had the perfect person for me to marry. And I said, well, that's fine. And he said, but she's engaged. I said, well, then why did you tell me? Anyway, a year passed, and he was back selling me China, and he said, that girl is no longer engaged. I said, well, I'd like to meet her. She worked at Bloomingdale's in New York. She'd graduated from Connecticut College. So I went to New York, I met her, and knew that I would marry her after the first date. And so we had about 5 dates, but she wouldn't say yes until I came to Little Rock to meet her parents because her previous engagement hadn't worked out. They didn't like him. So I passed, and we got married in December, and I had been living, as I said, in Houston, but decided that it would be better for Carolyn for the two of us to start our lives here in Dallas. Because in Houston, I was obviously single, and I was, and I had a lot of friends there, and I was on all the debutante lists, and I had a lot of girlfriends, and so I just thought it'd be better for us to start a new life together. So we did, and I took the job at Neiman Marcus, and I came here as the gift buyer. And after a while, I got promoted to merchandise man, and then I worked for Edward Marcus in the mail order division. In between that, I left Neiman Marcus in about 1968, and I was offered the job at a store in Boston called Design Research. So I went there for a year, and the man who ran it and I didn't get along. The store had been in bankruptcy. A friend of mine had bought it and put me in as president, but the former owner didn't believe that he didn't own it anymore, so we had a problem. Anyway, during the time that I was in Boston, Neiman Marcus was sold to Carter Hawley Hale, which meant that I would be eligible to be promoted. Before, you had to be a Marcus to get very high. So I was rehired by Neiman Marcus. So I came back and was happy to come back to Dallas. I mean, we loved living in Cambridge. But anyway, I was happy to come back here. And the deal was that Edward Marcus was going to retire in 2 years, and then I would completely take over the mail order. After 2 years, I asked him what he would be doing when he retired, and he said, well, I've changed my mind, I'm not going to retire. So I just didn't know what to do, but I had always had this idea that somebody ought to have a catalog. The Neiman Marcus catalog was dependent on the suppliers paying, like Estee Lauder would buy a page or 2 pages, and then they would dictate what would be in the catalog. And I kept thinking, well, it would be better if we could pick, because we knew what sold, but the suppliers wanted their name and this and that. So I thought up the idea, if somebody had a catalog that didn't accept advertising money, but just bargained for the lowest possible price for the merchandise, and then did a catalog of all the things that they thought would sell. And of course, I presented to Stanley Marcus, who said it was a silly idea. And so I still thought it was a good idea. In the meantime, some friends that I had in New York had formed a conglomerate. This was in like 1970 when everything was conglomerates. They had bought Cartier, Mark Cross, George Jensen, Valentino, Kenneth J. Lane, and they owned all those companies. So I had the idea that I would make a catalog of all their entities, and that I would just pick all the merchandise. That would be easy. So they said yes, and I said, I'll do it, but you have to put up all the money and let me live in Dallas, because by then Carolyn was pregnant with our 3rd daughter and our 3rd child, and I thought we better stick around here. So I started the catalog, and originally it was called the Kenton Collection. After a year and a half, a man named Meshlem Rickless, the Kenton Corporation started going downhill for many reasons I don't know, but anyway, Meshlem Rickless took it over, and he called me in his office and said, we're going to close your catalog because you're losing money. And I said, but sir, everybody loses money the first year. We're going to make it this year. He said, no. So he said, you go back, and if you can bring me $1 million in 30 days, I'll let you have the catalog. So I thought, well, I know all these rich people in Texas to be easy. So I came back and it wasn't easy. But I found out through a friend at the bank that I could pledge my inventory, and I got half the money for that. And then I did get money from my doctor, my lawyer, and many good friends, one of whom is from the local family, Michael Shannon. His family is an old family here. Anyway, lots of people. And so I bought the company, and then Rickla said, but you have to change the name. So anyway, Emily Hexter, who's from another old family, was sitting here in this living room, and I said, oh, what are we going to do? We've spent all this money making the Kenton Collection. She said, well, call it Horchow. I said, no, nobody would do that. And so anyway, I went in to tell Stanley that I was leaving. Or no, I told, by then I had left Neiman Marcus. Stanley said, well, who would buy from a catalog called Horchow? And I said, well, they bought from one called Neiman Marcus. And he laughed. So anyway, I started the catalog in 1971 and then changed the name in 73 and went along and had a wonderful time. We had a great time. Carolyn helped and the children helped. Everybody did. All my friends gave me ideas, and we kept getting a bigger and bigger warehouse here. So then when I turned 60, I decided that I should sell the company, because with a private company, and I had these stockholders, if somebody died, they would want to value the stock higher, and I'd want to value it lower, and we'd be in a mess with friends. So I thought, well, I'll just sell it. And so just at that time, Neiman Marcus had in the meantime been sold once again to General Cinema. And they came to me and said, we want to buy you. And so I sold the company to Neiman Marcus / General Cinema, and there I was back again. And this time I came back and they had us run their catalog. So I was the only vice president that left twice, came back. So then after selling it, I sold it for a lot of money. A lot more than they paid me when I started work at $75 a week. And so I decided that I wanted to do something completely different. So I had been very interested in musical comedy. And when I was little, George Gershwin came to my parents' house in Cincinnati. And my mother went to the concert, and he was getting a train to go to Chicago, so she invited him to our house. It was near the train station. So, I mean, I don't really remember it too well, but it's kind of a family story that George Gershwin played our piano, and I was a little boy, 6, and I heard it and came down because it wasn't my mother playing Chopin. And I got hooked on Gershwin, and so forever I loved Gershwin. And when I was at Yale, many of the Broadway plays opened in New Haven. So I went to everything, and I really liked musical comedy. So I contacted this man, Cameron McIntosh, and asked him if he wouldn't do a Gershwin play called Girl Crazy. And he said he didn't do revivals. So I had all that money, and Carolyn said, well, why don't you do it? And I said, well, I don't know how to do that, but I had invested in some plays. So I contacted a woman that was a friend in New York and said, I want to do the Gershwin play. Would you help me? So we had to go to the Ira Gershwin's widow and get her permission and jump through a lot of hoops. But anyway, we got the permission, and then we started this play. We changed the name to Crazy for You. We rewrote it was a dumb plot. Ours was even dumber, but the music was terrific. And so it was a huge success. We got 11 Tony nominations, and we won a bunch of Tonys, and it lasted 4 years. So I got hooked on the theater, completely different from Mail Order. So first I did Crazy for You, then I did a revival of Kiss Me Kate, and then one called Curtains, which I did Kiss Me Kate because Cole Porter, my father lived in the same room that Cole Porter vacated at Yale in 1914. My dad moved in the room. So that was the karma. And then curtains was candor and ebb, and so I'd iron curtains, so I wanted to do that. And the next one I did was Gypsy, which they played at our wedding in Little Rock, so I wanted to do that. And now I'm doing a revival. This is of Annie, and that'll open this in right after the election in 2012. So that's what I do now. I'm in the theater. I'm on a bunch of boards. I've been in Dallas, on the Symphony, the museum, KERA, in the Dallas Theater Center, and I was on the American Jewish Committee for some years. And that's about all that I do here. And in Yale, I'm on the Art Gallery board. And I've been on the board of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and the American Institute for Public Service, and the White House Conservation. I mean, a lot of different public service things. And in the Dallas community, I've always felt it was very important to, because we made our money here, to give back the money in Dallas. And so our name is on a hall at the museum, and a place at the Symphony, and the garden at the temple. And the point was not to brag about our family, but to, being Jewish, it was, I think, important to let it be known that we were philanthropic. And as far as the temple was concerned, since we were not particularly good members, I thought that would be good to do something like in the garden. So that's my everything to the present.
That's wonderful. I'd like to go back a little bit, so to rewind, so to speak, and ask you what your neighborhood was like when you grew up, and also about any Jewish affiliations during childhood and your parents' affiliations.
Well, my grandparents, who lived in Portsmouth, Ohio, invited every weekend, because they had no rabbi, they invited the men from Hebrew Union College to come there to preach. And so I heard all these famous names, Nelson Glick, and I can't remember the other names, but all very famous rabbis in later life used to come to Portsmouth. So my father and grandfather and grandmother knew them all. And when we were in Cincinnati, I went to Sunday school. And then when we lived in Columbus, my father taught the 10th grade and my mother taught the 3rd grade, because they figured they had to take me, they might as well teach. And my aunt, who was Methodist, became a Jew, and she was the head of the school. So we had a big family at the temple. It was a Bryden Road Temple in Columbus. And the rabbi was Rabbi Gupp. And so we were there until we moved away. And then when my neighborhood in Cincinnati was a mixed neighborhood. We were in a place which is now predominant, well, it became mostly Jewish and then it became black. And now it's kind of mixed. It was called Bond Hill, but Avondale was right next to it. And so my parents were very interested in Hebrew Union College. And years later, living here in Dallas, I sponsored a rabbi at one of the small temples in Colleyville from Hebrew Union College. We belonged, well, so growing up I always went to Sunday school, but I went away to boarding school, and so I didn't get confirmed. And in those days, Reform Jews didn't have bar mitzvah, so that was not even an option. But I didn't get confirmed because I was away at school. And then I went, then when we lived in Washington, I did go 1 year to Sunday school until we moved, till I went away to school. Then I didn't. And in Dallas, in Houston, I belonged to the temple, and I went. In Dallas, we went for a while. Rabbi Olin was the person that we loved so much. And also Rabbi Klein, but we just, I don't know, for one reason or another, we didn't go.
How much time do you spend in New York?
Well, now I spend about 90 days a year. So I go for like a week, and then I'll come home for a couple weeks and just go back and forth. because I mean, this is where I live, and 2 of my children live here. All of my grandchildren live here.
Tell me about your children.
Well, the oldest daughter, Reagan, is going to be 50 in December this year, and she went to Hockaday, and then she went to Yale, and then she went to North Texas to get an MA. And she's very interested in early childhood education, so she started a school in Oak Cliff, and then it merged with another school, and so she's always been interested in that. She's very entrepreneurial, and she's been on lots of boards, Planned Parenthood and Hockaday. She was the youngest chairperson of Hockaday for 3 years, and so that kept her quite busy. She was first married to a fellow named Rock Pillsbury, and they had a daughter, Samantha, who is now a freshman at Yale. She's the 4th generation in our family. And then she married Jeff Fearon, whose father went to the Hill School with me. That's how they met. And he's a craniofacial pediatric surgeon, and they have twin girls who are they'll be 10 in June. So they live here in Dallas. Lizzie, my second daughter, is 47, and she's married to a fellow named Dan Routman from Birmingham. And they have 2 daughters, Reagan and Emily, who go to Hockaday. Lizzie's very active in Hockaday mothers clubs and all things to do with the children and Planned Parenthood. And their children went to, Danny goes to temple, and he's religious, but the rest of us are not. Sally, the youngest, is 6 years younger than Lizzie, and she was born in 1970. She went to Hockaday till about the 9th grade, and she got tired of it, and so she went off to St. Paul's School for that, and then to Yale. Lizzie went to Tulane. She didn't want to go east. So Sally went to Yale, and then she worked in New York in the theater, and then she worked for Conan O'Brien, and then she went to Hollywood because her boyfriend was a writer for Seinfeld. So she went there, they broke up. She got the job as Steven Spielberg's assistant, so she worked for him for a couple years, and then she's now a freelance writer. Plus she has a new website. My wife used to say to the girls, "Oh, that's very good looking." So Sally's site is called verygoodlooking.com, in which she can write about anything she wants, just, a restaurant or a recipe or a dress. And she and I wrote a book together 2 years ago called The Art of Friendship, which was a big seller, and we enjoyed writing it together.
Tell me a little bit more about that book, how that came about.
Well, a guy named Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called The Tipping Point, in which he talked about me for a while. And a young man in town here had me to lunch. He's a book agent, and he had me tell some of my connection stories. And so he said that would be a good book about friends and everything. So I wrote it, but it was terrible because I'm not a good writer. And so he said we needed to hire somebody to work on it. And so it occurred to me, Sally's a wonderful writer. So I said, well, how about Sally? So she came in and we rewrote the whole book. But it was terrific because it was from her point of view as a young person and mine as an older person. So the book is sort of combines our different points of view. And it was fun because we both learned a lot about each other that we would never have learned in, just talking. So she kids me all the time because I violate all the 70 rules of friendship.
What are some of those rules?
Well, the one that I violate is don't keep score. You're not supposed to keep score, or, if somebody does something, you don't have to pay him back or vice versa, and you shouldn't hold grudges, but I do all of the above. She kids me. Well, the other rules are like keeping up with friends, and just because they don't call you, you should call them if they're your friend. Some people are just not good at keeping in touch, but if you like somebody, it's your burden to call them, which we both do. And we had lots of friends, both of us.
You mentioned that you had friends who helped you get started with the Horchow Collection. And you mentioned the Shanin family, which of course is a prominent Jewish family here. Were there other Jewish families involved?
Not in the formation of the company, but Emily Hexter and Victor, who are an old family. Victor was one of my early mentors, and then, as I said, Emily's the one who named it the Horchow Collection. So, no, those were the two families here.
Who are your role models, and what are you most proud of?
Well, I would say that Stanley Marcus would rank very high as a role model. And the other role models were two ministers. The father of my Hill School roommate was a Presbyterian minister that I used to visit in the summer in New Hampshire, and the other one was a man who was the chaplain of Yale. And those two men were very influential, and then later Stanley. So I would say those would be my role models, and my father, but my father died when I was just 30, so I missed a lot of that. And what was the other
What are you most proud of?
Well, I'm proud of my children. I mean, they're really terrific. And I have to be prouder of my wife, who was the key to raising such nice kids.
Anything else that you'd like to add?
Well, I just think that it's important, being a Jew, even if you're not religious, which, as I said, I'm not particularly. I think it's very important that you keep your identity rather than, like a lot of my friends in New York who intermarried or married out of it, and they've kind of disappeared. Like I have one friend who went to bed a Jew and woke up an Episcopalian. And so, I mean, he's from a really old New York Jewish family. So I just think it's important to never kind of pretend that you're not Jewish, and never, that, you know, just to be known. That's why I was always happy to be the American Jewish Committee. Actually, I enjoyed that. Milton Tobian got me involved in that. But I think it's a good idea, and my children too, because the school that I went to, there are only 3 Jews there. And as I said, my father was the first one, and I was the first Jew in a certain fraternity at Yale. And so somebody has to be first, and I just think that you shouldn't, the message to the children and the grandchildren that they need to know. So even though I wasn't religious, I always arranged to have a big Seder. And so we had a huge Seder. Well, it got to be bigger and bigger and bigger. And finally, the last one that I had here in this house, we had 40 people, and there were 12 Jews. And all the rest of the people were just thrilled to come here. And so they know more about the Seder than I do. So we do that, and then we had this big tree in the backyard, and that's where every holiday I would make the children, and Carolyn and I would sit there, and I would read the prayer book, every word, just exactly as it was in the temple, and then I'd give a little sermon. And I did that because I really didn't like going to the temple. There's too much noise, commotion, and people talking. So I had my own service. So they call me Rebbe.
Very good. Anything else you'd like to have included?
No, I mean, I didn't mention that my wife's family from Little Rock are very, very old Jewish family. They came there in 1800 and have been there ever since. And now I guess everybody in Little Rock was originally, every Jewish family was related to a Pfeiffer. Her name was Carolyn Pfeiffer, and everybody's a cousin. When I went there to be introduced, her mother had this huge party of relatives to meet. So they're an old family, and her brother Gene Pfeiffer is still there and very active in the temple in Little Rock, and her father was the president of the temple. So we have a long Jewish heritage. Unfortunately, I only have one totally Jewish family, which would be my middle daughter and her children and husband. But that's the way it is.
Thank you so much for agreeing to this. It's a wonderful, wonderful interview. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.